The lavender and brown butter smell that hits you when you walk into Bellamy's isn't something you can manufacture. My mother figured that out 30 years ago when she opened this place on the corner of Maple and Fifth, and I figured it out all over again when I took over after she passed. You can't fake the scent of a place that has been loved into existence. It soaks into the walls, the floorboards, the old wooden display cases my grandfather built by hand in his garage. People tell me they smell Bellamy's before they see it. That used to make my mother cry happy tears. Now it just makes me work harder to deserve it. I was elbow deep in a batch of cardamom brioche when my phone buzzed against the stainless steel prep counter. 6:15 in the morning. A text from my stepfather. Family meeting. Tonight, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. I stared at the screen long enough that my Sue's baker, Danny, looked over from the proofing rack. Everything okay? Fine, I said. I set the phone face down and kept working. My stepfather didn't do family meetings. In the 4 years since he'd married my mother, and the 2 years since she'd died, the only time he reached out was when something needed his signature or mine, and those interactions were brief, transactional, and cold. He tolerated me the way you tolerate a car alarm in the distance. Annoying, persistent, someone else's problem. I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was moving. Maybe he was getting remarried and wanted to tell me in person out of some misplaced sense of courtesy. By the time I handed the afternoon shift to Danny and drove across town to the house I'd grown up in, I had almost talked myself into optimism. His car was in the driveway. A black Range Rover, the kind that announces a man who wants you to know he leases things beyond his means. My mother's wind chimes were gone from the porch. She had made them herself from beach glass she collected over 15 years of summer trips. I stood on the front step for a moment looking at the bare hook where they used to hang, and I felt the first real chill of the evening. He answered before I knocked. That was the first sign. He'd been watching for me. Claire, he said, smiling the way men smile when they have already decided how a conversation ends. Come in. The living room had been rearranged. My mother's reading chair, the yellow one with the threadbare left arm she always meant to reupholster, was gone. The framed photo collage she made of Bellamy's first decade black and white prints of my grandmother, teaching her to pipe rosettes, newspaper clippings, a photo of me at age 7 with powdered sugar on my nose had been taken off the wall. In its place, a generic landscape print, the kind that comes with the frame. He gestured toward the couch, with his glass of scotch. I stayed standing. What's this about? I asked. He set his glass down on my mother's coffee table without a coaster. She would have hated that. Then he opened a leather portfolio and laid a document flat on the table in front of me with the theatrical care of a man who has been practicing this moment. I've sold Bellamy's, he said. The words didn't land. They floated in the air between us like something in a language I almost understood. I'm sorry? I've sold the bakery. He leaned back and crossed his arms. 38 years old and you're still playing house in a building that should have been sold when your mother passed. I found a serious buyer, a real estate development group out of Atlanta. They're converting the block into mixed-use commercial. Good money, Claire. Money your mother should have taken years ago instead of sinking everything into flour and butter. I looked at the document. A purchase agreement, the kind with signature lines at the bottom, dated 3 days ago. You can't sell Bellamy's, I said. You don't own Bellamy's. I own 49% of it. Your mother left me her share in her estate. He turned the document toward me and tapped a section near the top. And given the power of attorney she assigned me before her second surgery, I have full legal authority to act on her behalf regarding all assets. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. My mother's second surgery. 11 months before she died, when the cancer came back, and she was terrified and exhausted, and my stepfather was suddenly attentive in ways he hadn't been in years. She told me she'd signed some paperwork. Medical decisions, she said. Just in case things go sideways, sweetheart. I didn't read it closely enough. I trusted her to read it closely enough. You have a power of attorney over a dead woman, I said. I have a power of attorney that was assigned during her lifetime and covers all financial and property decisions. Her estate passed to me with those powers intact, according to her will, which your mother signed freely and in full capacity. He paused. I've already spoken with the attorney. It's clean. I own 51%, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. My father left it that way on purpose. Majority interest passes to the operating family member. He smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. Patient. Like he'd already thought of that. That's actually why I called you here tonight. The buyer's attorney has drafted a motion to the probate court, claiming that as a sole proprietor operating without a formal board structure, you've been making unilateral decisions that demonstrate financial recklessness. The argument is that the business requires oversight, and your mother's estate, which I now represent, has grounds to petition for a co-management order. He picked up his scotch again. In plain English, Claire, they're going to argue that you can't run this place alone. And while that's being processed, the sale of the 49% I do control is perfectly legal. Once the buyer owns 49%, they'll petition the court for a buyout of the remaining interest. It's a process. It takes a few months, but it ends the same way. I thought about the morning rush. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for a cranberry scone and told me I had my mother's hands. The high school kid I'd hired last spring, who cried when I told him he could stay on part-time through college. 30 years of birthday cakes and wedding orders and neighbors who knew our names. A development group from Atlanta who wanted to build condominiums on the corner of Maple and 5th. The closing is Friday at noon, my stepfather said. I thought you should hear it from me first. I'm not a monster, Claire, but I am practical. Your mother wasn't. I drove back to the bakery because I didn't know where else to go. Danny had locked up already. I let myself in through the back, turned on the low lights over the prep station, and sat down on a flour sack in the corner of the kitchen, the way I used to sit when I was small, and my mother was closing up for the night. The mixers were clean. The proofing racks were empty. The whole place smelled like the end of a good day. On the desk in the back office, under a stack of vendor invoices I'd been meaning to file, was a business card I'd been ignoring for 4 months. Hargrove Culinary Ventures. The name below it, Thomas Hargrove. I'd met him at a regional bakery conference in March. He'd handed me his card after sampling 3 of our pastries and looking around the space with the quiet, careful attention of someone who knows exactly what he's looking at. I don't want to change a thing about this place, he'd said. I just want to help it grow. I'd thanked him and said Bellamy's wasn't for sale. I turned the card over in my fingers. My mother used to say that stubbornness is just vision that hasn't figured out which direction to run yet. I picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. It was almost 9 o'clock. Mr. Hargrove, this is Claire Bellamy. We met at the Portland conference in March. A pause. Then, warmly, Claire, of course, the cardamom brioche. I'm calling because I may have changed my mind. About selling. Another pause. Different in quality. Careful. What changed? The situation changed, I said. Are you still interested? I've been interested since March, he said. What are you looking for? We talked for 2 hours. I learned that Thomas Hargrove was not a developer. He was a third-generation restaurateur who'd spent 20 years building a portfolio of independent food businesses across the Pacific Northwest with one operating philosophy. You don't fix what works. You resource it. He wanted Bellamy's because Bellamy's was already exactly what he looked for. He wanted to fund a second location, keep the original staff, keep the recipes, keep the name. He wanted me to stay on as general manager with an equity stake in the expansion. What would you offer? I asked. He named a number that made me press my hand flat against the desk. $2.8 million for controlling interest, he said. 51%. I've had my attorney review the ownership structure. Your interest is clean. I can have a letter of intent by morning and close by Friday if you need speed. I did need speed. Friday by 10 a.m., I said. Done. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my mother's kitchen for a long time. I looked at the framed photo I kept on the office wall her, standing behind the original display case. 26 years old, flower on her apron, grinning like the whole world was a gift she'd just unwrapped. She would have hated what my stepfather was doing. She also would have figured out a way to turn it into something. She always did. I ordered a cup of chamomile from the electric kettle in the corner and toasted the photo. For you, Mom, I said, and for whatever that man has coming. The next 48 hours moved the way important things move too fast and too slow at the same time. Thomas Hargrove's attorney was efficient and thorough. The purchase agreement for my 51% controlling interest was drafted that night, reviewed by my own attorney Thursday morning, and executed by 10:17 Friday morning. The wire transfer cleared before 11. I had $300 in my checking account on Wednesday night. By Friday noon, Hargrove Culinary Ventures owned Bellamy's. I owned a check for just over $1.5 million, representing my share of the sale price, a guaranteed management contract, and an ironclad clause that every current employee would be retained and offered a raise within 90 days. At 11:40, I drove to my childhood home for what I was fairly certain would be the last time. My stepfather had set up the dining room like a boardroom. His portfolio was open on the table. There was a printed agenda, which almost made me laugh out loud. He'd even put water glasses out. He was wearing the blazer he saved for what he considered important occasions. I'd seen it at my mother's funeral, and nowhere else. He frowned when he saw me. "You're not supposed to be here. I live 10 minutes away," I said. "Where else would I be? This is a private closing. You have no standing here." "It's my mother's dining room table," I said. "I spent a lot of time at it." He started to say something else, but the doorbell stopped him. The man my stepfather let in was named Derek Walsh. 60s, expensive watch, the particular posture of someone who makes large purchases routinely and finds the process slightly tedious. He was accompanied by a younger man carrying a briefcase who I assumed was his attorney. "Walsh," my stepfather said, hand extended, voice sliding into the register he used when he wanted to seem like the kind of man who closed deals. "Good to finally do this in person." Walsh nodded, barely. He glanced at me. "Who is this?" "Nobody," my stepfather said. "An estate matter. She was just leaving." "I'm the majority owner," I said pleasantly. "Claire Bellamy. My family's name is on the building." Walsh's attorney looked up from the briefcase. Something shifted in his expression. "My client is purchasing a 49% stake," the attorney said carefully, "from the estate of Linda Bellamy Marsh, represented by her spouse." "That's right," my stepfather said, spreading the purchase agreement on the table with both hands. 49%, at an agreed price of— "I need to flag something," Walsh's attorney said. He was looking at his phone. "My office sent me a notice this morning. A title search update." He turned the phone toward his client. Walsh looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Bellamy's Bakery," Walsh said slowly, "shows a change of ownership filed yesterday morning. 51% controlling interest transferred to Hargrove Culinary Ventures." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. My stepfather turned toward me. The color left his face in a single clean movement, like a tide going out. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound a man makes when a plan he has been assembling for months suddenly isn't there anymore. "I sold my 51%, I said. "To Thomas Hargrove. Controlling interest. Closed yesterday morning." I reached into my bag and set a copy of the executed purchase agreement on the dining room table, right next to his. "You're still welcome to sell your 49% to Mr. Walsh, of course. That's your right. But I'd encourage Mr. Walsh to think carefully about what he's buying." I looked at Walsh. "You'd be a minority partner in a business whose majority owner has a long-term management contract and full operational control. You couldn't change the name, the menu, the staffing, the hours, or the direction without majority approval. You'd be a passive investor with no path to control." Walsh's attorney was already putting papers back in the briefcase. "You cannot do this," my stepfather said. His voice had gone tight and strange. "I have a power of attorney. I have a court motion filed. I was in the process of—" "You had a power of attorney over your wife's 49%, I said. "My 51% was never part of your authority. It was never part of her estate. My father left it to me directly, and I have held it in my own name since the day I turned 25. Your attorney had that information. If he told you otherwise, you should have a conversation with him about malpractice." Walsh stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at my stepfather the way people look at things they are relieved not to have bought. "I don't know what kind of operation you're running," he said, "but I want nothing to do with it. My attorney will be in touch about the earnest money." My stepfather went pale at that. "The earnest money is non-refundable under the terms of a contract to sell an asset you didn't fully own," Walsh's attorney said from the doorway. "That's not a contract. That's fraud. We'll be in touch." The front door closed. The room felt very small. My stepfather stood behind the dining room table with his printed agenda and his water glasses and his blazer, and he looked for the first time since I'd known him, like exactly what he was, a man who had mistaken someone else's grief for an opportunity and gotten the math badly wrong. "You ruined this," he said. "Everything I put into this family, everything I did for your mother, and you ruined it." "You didn't do anything for my mother," I said. "You waited. And when she was gone, you went through her things, looking for something you could take. You took her wind chimes off the porch. You took her chair. You took her photos off the wall." I picked up my bag. "You don't get to take the bakery." I walked toward the door, and then stopped, because I wasn't finished. "My mother loved that building," I said. "She built it out of nothing, after my father died, with 2 little kids and a rented kitchen, and recipes written on index cards. She didn't do it because it made financial sense. She did it because she believed that a place where people felt welcome and fed and remembered was worth building even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard." I looked at him one last time. "Mr. Hargrove is keeping every single person on staff. He's giving them raises. He promised me the original recipes stay exactly as they are, and my mother's photo stays on the wall. Bellamy's will outlast both of us. You should think about what you're going to outlast." I left him standing in the dining room. My attorney called that evening to confirm that Walsh's legal team had already sent notice demanding return of the earnest money deposit, $60,000, my stepfather had accepted without disclosing the ownership. Dispute. The word his attorney used was fraudulent inducement. My attorney said the phrase with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news they find privately satisfying. The next few weeks were a complicated quiet. Thomas Hargrove came by Bellamy's the Monday after closing. Not in a suit, but in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he spent 3 hours in the kitchen watching Danny work and asking questions that showed he actually understood baking. He never touched anything without asking. He introduced himself to every single person on staff by name and told them directly that their jobs were safe and their opinions about the business were something he intended to earn over time. I watched him do it and thought about how differently a room feels when the person with power in it isn't performing. My stepfather retained an attorney and sent a letter claiming the sale of my interest was done in bad faith to deliberately undermine his transaction. His attorney was apparently unaware that bad faith requires acting against an obligation you actually have, and that selling your own property to a buyer of your choosing is not an obligation anyone has to their stepfather. My attorney responded in 2 paragraphs. We didn't hear back. What I hadn't anticipated was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Janet, who'd been distant since the funeral for reasons I'd attributed to grief, called me 3 weeks after everything collapsed. She'd heard what happened from a cousin. She said she needed to tell me something. She told me that my stepfather had approached her 8 months ago with a version of the plan. He'd wanted to get her to sign a statement supporting the incompetence argument, claiming she'd observed me making poor financial decisions. She'd refused. She said she'd felt guilty ever since for not warning me, and she was sorry she'd stayed quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because I didn't think he could actually do it," she said. "I thought your name on the deed would stop him. I underestimated how far he'd go." A pause. "Your mother would never have forgiven me. My mother would have wanted us to stay in each other's lives," I said. "Come to the bakery sometime. I'll make you the cardamom brioche." She taught me the recipe. She came the following Sunday and cried in the second booth from the window, which is where my mother used to sit when she needed to think. I sat with her for an hour before the afternoon rush, and we talked about my mother the way I hadn't been able to talk about her in 2 years. Not around her absence, but through it, toward the parts that were still present. The recipes, the rituals, the particular way she salted everything twice because she said the first time was for the food and the second time was for luck. The legal situation resolved itself over the following months in the particular way these things do, slowly, with paperwork and without any single dramatic conclusion. The probate court dismissed the co-management motion for lack of standing once it was established that my 51% had never been part of my mother's estate. The Walsh earnest money dispute went to mediation. I was not a party to it. Whatever my stepfather paid back, or didn't, was between him and his attorney, and whatever remained of his savings. Thomas Hargrove and I broke ground on the second Bellamy's location in September, a space in the East Side neighborhood, bigger than the original, with a proper teaching kitchen in the back where we planned to run community baking classes on weekends. My mother had talked about doing that for years. She'd sketched out a curriculum once on a yellow legal pad. I found it in a box in the attic when I was clearing out her things, still in her handwriting. dated 11 years ago. We framed it and hung it in the teaching kitchen. The opening day of the second location was a Friday in early October. Thomas brought a bottle of champagne and a gift wrapped in brown paper. I opened it in the kitchen before service. A framed copy of the deed to the original Bellamy's, the one my mother had filed 30 years ago, her signature at the bottom in her careful, looping hand. Below it, a small card in Thomas's handwriting. The original stays exactly as it is, and so does everything she built. I thought about my stepfather, wherever he was. I'd heard from my cousin that he'd left the state, moved somewhere south to start over. I didn't wish him harm. I just wished him an honest accounting of himself, which felt like it might be harder. Danny made a toast at the end of service that night, glass raised to the room full of staff and neighbors and people who'd driven across the city because they'd read about the opening. She talked about my mother, who she'd never met, the way people can talk about someone they've only known through their work and through the people who love them. To Linda Bellamy, she said, who built something that outlasted everything that tried to take it down. I raised my glass and looked at the photo I'd had framed above the pass-through my mother behind the original display case, flower on her apron, grinning. Same photo I kept at the first location, same expression, the particular look of a woman who has decided, against all reasonable odds, that what she loves is worth the work. I thought about what she used to tell me when I'd complain as a teenager that the bakery was too much, too demanding, too consuming, too present in every part of our lives. The things worth having are always a little inconvenient, she'd say, sliding something out of the oven, not looking up. That's how you know they're real. She was right about that. She was right about most things. Which is maybe the most frustrating and comforting thing about grief, that the person you lost keeps being right long after they're gone. 6 months after the closing, I was prepping for the morning rush at the original Bellamy's when Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway with a look on her face she gets when something has happened and she isn't sure if it's good or bad. There's a woman out front, she said. She says she's your stepfather's ex-wife. Not your mother, a different one. Before your mother. I set down the pastry brush. It turned out my stepfather had done this before. In a different city, with a different widow, involving a different small business. A flower shop. The woman in the front booth, Renata, 62, gray-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had been through something and rebuilt, had been looking for people he'd targeted for 3 years. She had a file. She was building a civil case. I heard what you did, she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. That you caught him in time. Not everyone catches him in time. I sat across from her and I listened. Outside, on Maple and Fifth, the morning was starting. I could hear the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up traffic. A delivery truck idling, someone walking a dog past the window and pausing to look at the display case the way people had been pausing to look at it for 30 years. The lavender and browned butter smell was already working its way out the door. It doesn't stop. That's the thing about a place that has been loved into existence. It keeps reaching out, keeps saying here, keeps saying come in. My mother figured that out first. I'm just the one making sure it never stops. I told Renata everything I knew.